Deploying config manager clients and managing client settings. This process used to really suck. Back in 2007 and even more so in 2003 in SMS, deploying and managing the config manager client was an absolute pain in the neck. And it's gotten better, admittedly. This version really does some better job it does a better job of making sure that all the pieces sort of lay into place so that you can actually deploy the clients. One of the challenges is the fact that there is the perception that there are a lot of different clients out there. I'm going to help you kind of demystify all of the different client options that can sometimes get thrown at you. Another of the challenges is really the fact that there are a lot of different ways in which clients can get deployed. So I list the major ones here. You can push it out from the console, which is the method that most people kind of look at first and go, aha, but it's really not the best method. Some of the better methods are group policy. Right? You can actually deploy the client out with group policy, and in the old days, that was one of the most successful ways to ensure that the client got out really well. We also have this notion of a software update point method using a WSUS server. So many of us have WSUS infrastructures already in place. And so I can, with my config manager server, point at a WSUS server and say, you are now also a software update point. And because you are a software update point, and the clients are already talking to you to get their WSUS updates, well, why don't you just go and deploy the client also? In addition to that, we have the manual way. You can do it via logon script. One caution about logon script installations is that you have to be an administrator for a logon script installation to work. Arguably the same thing with the manual way. Software distribution is use config manager to deploy config manager. That's usually used for updates. And then these last two over here, OS deployment and then computer imaging. These two, when we get into the OSD part, so computer deployment part, I'll talk about how you can do that. You can put essentially right on the image that you deploy the config manager client so that when the image deploys, the client's already on there. Now, to get the client on is one thing. Before we even get that far, we have to actually set up what we want those client settings to be. And you don't have to do it beforehand, but it's just nice. The clients will actually poll for an updated policy every 60 minutes by default. And that updated policy will turn on or off additional functionality if you set it up in client settings. One of the really neat new features of client settings in 2012 is this new granular distribution of client settings data. Back in the old days, if you wanted to change a remote tools policy so that this user had to approve that you wanted to remote them, but you didn't want to have an approval for your servers to remote them because they're in the data center, you had to create a completely different site to do that. And a new site with new hardware and new configurations just simply because you want one setting different from the other. Really, really, really complained about in old versions, and it's been completely revamped now in Config Manager 2012. So in this nugget, we are going to take a look at the client settings. Once we have the client settings, I'm going to show you some of the basic ones, and I'm going to get to the other ones as we get to them. I can't really show you like the NAP client setting until we get to NAP, or I can't really show you OSD until we get to OSD. So I'll show you the basic ones, and then we'll come back again and again as we talk about different topics. Then we'll talk about how we can go about deploying the client. Now down here are the 3 client settings files that exist in Configuration Manager, and you need to know what these are. You need to know what they are. You need to know why they're different, because they will be confusing if you don't learn them now. And you might want to take some notes here. So ccmsetup.msi, this installation file is used exclusively by group policy. So group policy, you will use ccmsetup.msi. You will add that into a group policy object, and you will use group policy software installation to actually deploy the client out. You will use this in addition with a pair of custom ADM files that you'll have to add into group policy that will configure it for you. Again, in my experience in the past, we're a month into 2012, but in the past, 2007 clients deployed with really, really good efficiency using group policy. Now, a lot of the confusion happens because ccmsetup.msi looks the same as ccmsetup.exe, which you use for essentially everything else. everything else. So if I'm doing a manual mode, if I'm doing a logon script, if I am doing really under the covers, if I'm doing client push, even if I'm doing software distribution, I'm going to use ccmsetup.exe for everything else. Interestingly enough, this ccmsetup.msi is kind of buried in the program files location, so you kind of have to find it. They're trying to make it harder for you to get confused by these three. This third one you will never invoke directly, so don't ever invoke it directly. And the reason for that is client.msi is actually called by ccmsetup.exe when an installation needs to happen. Now here's where things get really confusing for people. The switches that you need to use to launch the setup and to install the client actually come in two parts, and that's why I have to tell you about the differences between these two. Some of the switches are consumed by CCM setup, while other switches are consumed by client.msi. I know this gets weird. The shortcut here is generally if the switch starts with like a switch does, the slash, so setup.exe / whatever. Generally that's one that's consumed by this CCM setup. Everything else is passed to the inside as client.msi. Okay, so I know clear as mud. I totally get it. So let me show you what I mean by this. I'm going to minimize this and actually minimize this as well because I want to bring up a website. This website is called About Client Installation Properties in Configuration Manager. I would highly recommend that you bookmark this site because in it you will learn all of the command line syntax that you'll need for manually deploying the client out or for scheduling or putting it in as a package or an application. For the most part, you will use just this string. ccmsetup.exe, and that /mp is for your management point, which in our case is config mgr1, /logon SMS site code equals whatever your site code is, and then your failback status point, which we'll install here in just a minute. It's just another site role. There are some additional properties here, and you'll notice these are the ones that relate to CCM setup, and you'll see how they start with slashes. Service, no service, uninstall, logon, force reboot, etc. These can control how that client gets installed. Then when you want to pass additional settings into the inside installer, which is client.msi, notice how their property equals something. So whatever equals 1, whatever equals server name. So these allow you to customize things even further. Again, two types of files, one calls the other, two types of switches, one for the inside, one for the outside. Okay, and if you can remember that and bookmark this website, you will be golden for what you need to know to get things installed. So that's kind of what's necessary for kind of getting started with installing the client. Now here in the interaction portion, what I want to do is spend just a minute showing you these client settings, and these are the basic client settings. And I want to show you just in generalities how you go about starting up client push, deploying via group policy, which is still my personal favorite way to do things, and then also just some of the manual stuff. And honestly, you've kind of seen the manual stuff from that website, but I'll do it there for completion's sake. We'll start by taking a look at the client settings. So let me go back here into config mgr1. You'll see here we're under discovery methods. We've just finished the discovery methods and also setting the boundaries for this server. And so the next thing we have to do here is set up client settings. Remember that in 2012, I can now set multiple different client settings policies. If I right-click here, you'll see I can create custom client, device, or user settings. And if I give them a name, my custom settings, I can choose which settings I'm going to override for this subset of devices. So maybe I want to set up remote tools, and instead of users can change policy or notification settings, I'm going to set that to true because this subset of users needs that. Well, you'll see that my custom settings now appears with a priority of 1. It's the same kind of flow-through effect that you would expect. I mean, this is kind of how, strangely enough, how XenApp does some of its priorities. If you've seen the XenApp console with priorities and lining things up and inverting settings and things like that. So everything else then flows down to whatever the default settings are if I don't set them up here. I can change items in here, increase its priority, decrease its priority. I can deploy out those settings. I can also set the security scope for the selected securable objects. So we'll get into how you define these a little later. I can't really talk about security scopes yet until we get a little bit further along, but just assume that there is the capability now to create custom settings policies for subsets of devices or subsets of users, and that is a very, very good thing. For the rest of us, let's take a look at the default settings. And there's a number of these that I'm just going to ignore for now, and if I skip over them, don't worry, I'm going to come back to them, because it's hard for me to, for example, talk about hardware inventory until we talk about hardware inventory. So we'll get back to that, don't worry. Just a few of these that I want to point out for now. Number one, bits. Classic trade-off in relation to bits. Bits is a beautiful tool for latent networks and low bandwidth networks for getting content passed out to those networks, even if they're intermittently having problems. And if you can dial down bits for certain clients to throttle, for example, during the middle of the day when they would send out packages. So the trade-off is it just takes longer for me to send the package because I've dialed down how much maximum throughput I'm allowing for that client. If I'm on a LAN, you just leave this as false. On a WAN, you might want to do this to protect your available bandwidth. Here under client policy, the client policy polling interval is by default every 60 minutes. This says every 60 minutes. If any of these things change, go ahead and figure out what changed. Also, do I want to do user policy polling on clients? This is a good thing. As I mentioned before, Config Manager 2012 now has this focus on users, and so I want to really do that user policy polling here because I want to be able to deploy out an application to a user wherever they may be. If I'm dealing with internet clients, do I want to enable user policy requests from those clients? We're not dealing with that right now, so we can leave that as false. Skip down here to Computer Agent. Here under Computer Agent, just a few of these that I want to point out is these identify what sorts of notifications I'm going to give to users whenever things are happening. What are my deployment deadlines here? We'll talk about application catalogs and websites a little later. What's the organization name? My IT org. What are my install permissions? Okay, who can install stuff? And then some of these other things I'm going to push off for a little later. How do I want to notify users when restarts are pending? Okay, do I want to display a notification or a dialog box? Also power management here. Do I want to allow power management of devices? So if you've played with power management before in group policy, very similar to how it works in group policy. A lot more instrumentation. So there's more data that you can pull out and very pretty reports. But really it's about the same thing of what you've seen before in group policy. A big one is remote tools, and for some environments a source of much consternation. So remote tools determines what the experience is when your config manager users need to remote somebody else's computer. And in some environments this is not a problem. In some environments this is an absolute political nightmare. And a lot of it has to do with whether you allow people to remote control and whether you prompt them or not. Now back in the old days, but when you had one policy for an entire site, remember, we use Config Manager on servers sometimes as well as desktops. And so Config Manager's remote control was nice because I could remote control the console of that server, potentially. And I didn't want to have to ask permission because that's why I'm remoting the server. It's in the data center. I don't want to have to walk there to click yes to walk back to my desk. So these days, this can make the whole political consternation much better because you can set the prompt user for remote control to true for the desktops and to false for the servers. Same thing down here. What's the access level that's allowed? Who are the permitted viewers of remote control? I want to set these to, for example, domain, the IT group. I'll put in domain admins, for example. Do I want to show a session notification icon on the taskbar? Do I want to play a sound? This one's kind of fun, actually. If you set it to repeatedly during session, it annoys the heck out of users, too, because it just goes ding, 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 ding throughout the entire session. Do I want to do remote assistance also? So there's the old school remote control for really old clients, and then for the newer clients like Vista and 7, there's remote assistance and remote desktop. All of these are contained here within remote tools, and you can adjust these again based on what clients you're looking for. Many of these, let's see, the rest of these are stuff that we're not interested in looking at yet. State messaging is just how often do I want to report up what my state is. So when do I want to send up messages? So I've set a few of these now. Okay, this now defines what that client behavior is when those clients get deployed. So now let's go ahead and deploy some clients. The first thing I want to do to get clients deployed is to actually add a new role, new site role to the server that we have. And that site role is called the failback status point. So sometimes clients fail. It's one of the idiosyncrasies of Config Manager for many versions. When those clients fail, there needs to be some other service endpoint out there that's listening for clients when they holler, hey, something's going wrong. Without that, there's no way to grab those state messages, those issues, the error messages whenever clients have problems. So I start here from Config Manager in config mgr1, and actually from this server, I want to add the failback status point role. You'll notice it says it helps you monitor client installation and identify clients that are unmanaged because they're having problems communicating with their MP. What are the number of state messages I care about? Am I going to throttle things? Yes, no. There's not much to see here. And poof, it's installed. Okay, all we're doing is installing this role onto the server so it can perform those services. And the reason why this is a separate installation is because I could potentially install this to a different server. I could create a new site system server, call it my IT file server, and make it an FSP. So you don't have to put it on a site server, or you don't have to put it on an existing site server if you don't want to. With that failback status point in place, let's start by the very simple way, which is the manual mode client installation. So minimize this, and the manual mode client installation, as I recall from this Config Manager cheat sheet here, is really this series of commands. Okay, CCM setup with some stuff afterward. And I'm going to copy that to the clipboard, and we'll adjust that here in just a minute. So with that, then the other thing you'll want to do is be aware of a share on your site server. Okay, this SMS NGT share connects you up to essentially the main program share, or the main program path on your site server. I find that a lot of people like to also create a share to this client location. So from here, go to Properties, Sharing, Advanced Sharing, and share this folder as just Client. Okay, set the permissions so everyone can read it, for example. Make sure the security here is set up so that everyone has read control as well. So this allows me to go directly to that client location. So Config Manager 1, client, and then bam, there's CCM setup. So again, this just makes things easy. And from here, if I wanted to, I could, from the command line, go to, let's see, I think it's in Program Files, and CD, I think it's Configuration Manager, CD Microsoft Configuration Manager. And then there's the location that we were at, and then clients, or client, singular. So from here, I can run that executable that we were working with before, CCM setup, and then I need to change my management point, because that's not the right one. It's config mgr1, and then SMS site code is now NGT for nugget, and then the failback status point is config mgr1. I execute this, and it's actually going to deploy out the client. Okay, so run that, poof. That should begin installing the client on this computer. Now, one of the ways you can test to see if it's really working or not is to go up here to Windows Task Manager and look for this process called ccmexec.exe, or excuse me, ccmsetup.exe. ccmsetup.exe is kind of the wrapper. I mean, it's the command that we just executed, and it wraps around a bunch of other stuff that ultimately gets the client installed. And you can watch this CCM setup. Normally in a regular client, you won't see CCM exec. You can watch this to see if it's actually consuming CPU cycles. Eventually, it will begin launching MSI exec processes and installing various portions of itself to this local computer. If CCM exec, you notice down here we're running MSI exec processes in the background. If this CCM exec process eventually switches from CCM exec or CCM setup to CCM exec, so from CCM setup to CCM exec, then that we know that we have a successful client installation, generally. So this can take a period of time. It'll take a couple of minutes here to go about doing its thing. And in fact, once it switches from CCM setup over to CCM exec, well, it takes even a greater period of time. Because once the client installs, then it has to wait for its policy retrieval cycle to go and grab the policy from the site server, from the management point, download it, and then parse the policy. So it takes some time here for this to run. Don't sweat it. You might go, if you're testing this out in a lab, you might go get a cup of coffee. 10, 15 minutes sometimes to wait for this whole process to go through its entirety from start to completion. You'll know everything is completely up and running when you go to your control panel on that computer, and you can see the configuration manager pieces installed there. And you'll notice they're not here yet, but they will be here in just a minute. So when you see that configuration manager, that's the control panel that controls, well, the client stuff that's on that computer. It'll eventually make its way there. So this is the process using the manual mode. I mean, you could, I don't know, you could use, if you were a sly person, you could use PowerShell and invoke -command to, shoot this out to all the different computers, in a list. If you're not so PowerShell friendly, even psexec might work. In fact, back in the day, psexec was a great way to get it out to machines that were having problems. Many of us prefer not to use the manual mode, but instead to use the client push mode, which is found inside of Configuration Manager. In order to use client push, we've got to set up a couple of things first. So the first thing we want to do is under Sites, and you'll notice this item here called Hierarchy Settings. So hierarchy settings, first we have to set it up so we're actually using the failback site. That way that we know clients are, we're completing the path for that failback status point. And then also, you'll notice here we can choose what our client approval method is. By default, we're automatically approving computers and trusted domains. Most of the, for 98% of environments, this is okay. And the reason for that is because you can assume that if you're in a domain that you trust, you've already that client's authenticated to the domain, so it is considered a trusted client. So by the transitive property, it should be okay. If you need a little bit more control, well, you might choose to manually approve each computer. Most people don't automatically approve all computers so that you can't get, backdoored. Config Manager now will automatically resolve conflicting records. If you have duplicate hardware IDs from different clients, this used to be a real pain in the neck. Nowadays, automatic resolution really eliminates a lot of these conflicting records, makes things much, much easier. So you would want to leave that on. Client installation settings is used during upgrades of clients. So right now, and we haven't gotten this far, but there is essentially an application that's been installed to our distribution points that includes the client. And that application is using the stuff that we are using here. Now we can, if we update the client, we will automatically, if we create a new package for the client, well, we'll automatically update that client whenever the upgrade's available. So this is nice because it allows the clients to stay updated anytime that they request information from the site and they say, oh, look, there's a new client there. Well, go ahead and automatically upgrade those clients. Again, nice feature here. If you have those packages already set up, you can also automatically distribute that package to your DPs when they're enabled for pre-staged content. We'll talk about pre-staged content, but that's a mechanism you can use to package up content and send it out via alternative mechanisms. So these are, again, some settings you'll want to take care of, again, before we even get to client push. We're still not done yet. I mentioned that client push is one of those settings that a lot of people forget about because there's so many different places where you can forget something. Also here under the site is the client installation settings for client push. If I check this box, you'll notice that this will automatically begin pushing clients to any newly discovered computer. So when your Active Directory computer discovery finds new machines, well, then they're going to get that client pushed to them automatically. Now, you can turn this on. It really kind of simplifies things if you're doing discovery. We didn't really do that in the old days because a lot of us didn't turn on those levels of discovery because of all the problems that we had. I've got other machines in this domain that I don't necessarily want the client on, but be aware that, well, this is here and you can make it available. Also, you can install the Config Manager client on domain controllers if you want. I can choose whether to or not to install it on domain controllers. This brings up a really important point. There is a high likelihood that at some point you may create, or someone, your junior perhaps, it's always the junior admins creating the problems, may create a package that they inadvertently deploy out to the all systems collection. And if you don't have that all systems collection really well locked down so they can't do that, you may end up with packages deployed out to, for example, domain controllers. So you have to really think hard about whether or not you want your DCs as part of your config manager infrastructure. Same thing with the servers too. In order to push clients, we have to have an account to push clients as well. We can create an account here by choosing new account. And I've created an account already in this Active Directory domain called SMS Client Install. And I gave it domain admin rights, but in your environment, you just need to give this the rights so that it can deploy software to your desktops. So it needs to be a local admin on any machine that may potentially get an SMS client. With that, I can punch in the password. There's my password that I should really make shorter. And I can verify that this is all working by connecting it up to a network share here. There's that Config Manager client share that I can test. And if everything comes back good, then it should be okay. One interesting sort of oddity about this verification is if you have other windows open to that share, you're going to get a little error message here. So don't fret if you get an error message. Just make sure you close all the other windows so that you only have one connection to this potential share. When you have that set up, you click OK, and there's the client push installation account. And then lastly, if there are any additional installation properties that you would want to add to this. So for example, I might want to add, in addition to SMS site code, I might want to add FSP equals config mgr1, for example. When I'm done, OK. So that now enables essentially the pieces that need to get put in place so that I can support performing client push. The client push actually happens not from this location, but up in assets, because if you think about it, well, I want to push it to the various assets that are out there. So for example, let's say that I have this domain controller that I want to push this client out to. If I right-click the domain controller and choose Install Client, that'll bring up the Install Configuration Manager Client wizard. Choose Next, and always install it from a specified site or wherever I want. Choose Next again, and then Next again, and you can see that, well, it's going about doing its thing. If I choose Close here, now, back in the old days, SMS, we used to joke, stood for slow moving software. And the reason for that is because most of what goes on in Config Manager in an SMS happens behind the covers. You don't necessarily see these things directly happening. So there's no instant gratification with Config Manager. What you have to do is kind of sleuth around to see, well, what's happening under the covers. Let me remote over to this domain controller, and let's just see if anything's happening yet. if I show the processes from all the users, well, looky there. There's CCM setup.exe that happens to be running in the background, not doing anything, not notifying anything about what's going on, but slowly installing the SMS client out to this machine. That's good. That's good to know. In fact, if we take a look at the installation that we kicked off just a second ago, we'll see that CCM exec is actually now the only item here, and hopefully if I go to Control Panel, cross fingers, we will find Configuration Manager here. So yay, successful deployment of the client via both client push and the manual mode. Now you'll notice here that the components will show installed and disabled in certain circumstances. Notice the Remote Tools agent is currently not installed. You'll notice there are a number of actions here that I can do for running the machine policy retrieval cycle or the software metering cycle, software inventory cycle, those sorts of things. I have the ability to change the site code if I want. Okay, that you'll notice that it's automatically been sent to the NGT site because of what we did with our boundaries earlier. I can adjust the cache if I want. Okay, usually that cache is set at the time of install using one of the switches that are out there, but I can adjust the cache. Additional configuration baselines, as well as any network stuff that's here, so proxy information and internet-based client management stuff. There will be more tabs that appear here based off of which of the actual client components are installed and enabled. Okay, so different components will support different feature sets in that Configuration Manager location. So that's the second of the three. The third of the three is using group policy. Now before we do that, one of the things that we have to do first is actually to locate this group policy MSI file. If I go here to C and then to Program Files, Configuration Manager, I can't find CCM setup.msi in this location. That's because it's actually here under bin i386. Notice here's CCM setup.msi. So I want to make sure that this is available so that I can make use of it for group policy. One of the ways that I do that is to just make it available in the client location. It's kind of a copy-paste sort of thing. Then from that location, I can then go to my domain controller. Here's back on DC again. And I can set up a group policy. Let me do that here. I'll open up the group policy management console. And I will create a new group policy that I'm not going to attach to anything. Okay, I'm not going to necessarily associate this with a domain or an organizational unit. We'll just create it down here in the group policy sort of objects location. So let's create that group policy for install config mgr client. Two things have to happen. The first is you have to use the group policy software installation piece to actually install the client. Okay, the second is that there are a pair of custom ADM files that you'll use in managing the installation, and you can do them from the same GPO. The first happens up here in computer configuration under policies. So group policy software installation, if you've never used it before, can be set on the computer side or on the user side. The user side tends to make things a little bit more optional for users. The computer side is, you happen to be a computer, I'm going to deploy something to you. And so that's where we want to set this up. It's here under software settings. So if I choose new package here, that will bring up group policy software installation and will prompt me for the location of the package that I want to install. That package has to be in some location that is network accessible by all the machines that would receive this group policy. It is. By copying it over to that location on Config Manager 1, well, I've made it available in the client location, and there's CCM setup.msi. I'll choose Advanced here just to show you what the different screens look like, but there's really not much you need to see in these screens. This essentially just identifies how the package is going to get deployed here in Configuration Manager. Not much here. You're not really modifying things. There are no categories. There are no upgrades to that package. If I click OK, you'll see that Config Manager Client Setup is now available here inside of the group policy. So again, this installs the agent, or installs the client. if you've got your Active Directory extended and you've got all the values populated, this may be all that you need to do. However, I have found in the past that sometimes that doesn't always necessarily work. So you may want to make use of a couple of ADM templates. If you recall, if you right-click on administrative templates, you can actually add additional policy templates into group policy. Those group policy templates are going to be found also on your config manager server, MGR1, and in the SMS site code location in the tools folder. Here's tools, called config manager ADMT or ADM templates. These two are those templates. If you add them, one is the assignment and the other is the installation template. These two templates will now add additional administrative templates here in the group policy that you can populate with the stuff that you want for managing that client. Down here under classic administrative templates are the two, Configuration Manager 2012 and the client. So if I go down here to the client, I can see the site assignment and the client deployment settings. For site assignment, what I want to do is, come on there little buddy, is set the actual client site here, NGT for example. I can also set the retry interval and the retry duration if I want. For the next setting, this is the client deployment settings here. And it's in this location that I would add in those extra command line pieces that I would want to add in for installing the client, which in my case would be SMS site code equals NGT and then config manager 1, or F for the failback status point. So all kinds of different options here for getting this stuff deployed. And this will set those items here for that group policy, for getting it installed, getting it deployed appropriately. When I'm done, I close this group policy out and then attach that to an organizational unit, and poof, out go those clients with the next refresh of group policy. So these are the steps that you have to be aware of whenever you're going about that client installation process. I told you this was not going to be necessarily trivial. Not to mention the fact that we've only gone through a subset of all the different options that are out there. We've gone through just specifically client push, group policy, and then the manual way. Now your logon script way is essentially similar to your manual way. Just throw that into a logon script somewhere, maybe add some logic surrounding it, and you should be good. We'll talk a little bit about software updates when we actually install our software update point here a little later. And we'll also talk about OS deployment software distribution up in some upcoming nuggets. But these are mainly the three kind of key ways that you'll get that client pushed out right now. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've talked about config manager clients and managing those client settings. We went through an initial look at some of those client-side settings and how you might want to set those to control client behaviors. We went through a few of the multiple client installation methods that are out there, talked about the client installation files, and then went through in the interaction portion actually configuring client settings and going through the three major deployment mechanisms for getting clients out to the machines on your network. Coming up next is a discussion on hardware and software inventory. This is where we start really digging into some of the really neat sorts of collections that you can create out of that hardware and software inventory. But until then, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.